Coming up next, we invite you to participate in a live viewer call-in program with Christopher Hitchens, author of Blood, Class, and Nostalgia, Anglo-American Ironies, and Richard Critchfield, author of An American Looks at Britain. Hitchens is a columnist for Nation magazine and is Washington editor for Harper's Magazine. Critchfield has authored 5 books and is one of the first MacArthur Fellows. They join us to talk about events in the news.
Richard Critchfield, author of the new book, An American Looks at Britain. Why are you so interested in Great Britain?
Well, my specialty is not Britain at all, I should hasten to say. The Economist asked me to write this book because I knew them, but I didn't know Britain. And they wanted somebody to take a kind of a totally new look at the country, an outsider's view or a fresh look. And so I was very alarmed and said, no, I can't do it because I don't know enough about Britain. And then I sort of thought about it and did it. And it was an extremely wonderful experience because they're so interesting to talk to.
Why do Americans care so much about Great Britain, or do they?
Well, yes, it's because of our the common culture and the common history and whatever, and I think we're especially right now we're going to care more because we're becoming more Spanish and more Oriental and whatever, and so our essential culture we have to kind of hold to, which is English, of course.
Had you spent much time in Britain before you wrote this book?
No, I'd only spent one summer. I'd been at Oxford for the summer, and was going home, and the Economist asked me to do the survey, so I did come home and went back again. And did the survey. They gave me 6 months to run around and talk to everybody I could and see every place I could, and then 2 weeks to write it, which was a very tough schedule for 20,000 words. It was like a little book. And then I came home and came back and spent a year doing about 300 interviews. And it was just a great experience. I enjoyed it enormously. They were very hospitable. Almost anyone I asked to see agreed. It was astonishing. I can't imagine whether you could do that kind of a book in another country or not, but you certainly could with the British.
What parallels did you see in Britain that we are going through here in the United States?
Well, the interesting thing is now, the other day I picked up the New York Times.
Much time in Britain before you wrote this book?
No, I'd only spent one summer. I'd been at Oxford for the summer, and was going home, and the Economist asked me to do the survey, so I did come home and went back again, and did the survey. They gave me 6 months to run around and talk to everybody I could and see every place I could, and then 2 weeks to write it, which was a very tough schedule for 20,000 words. It was like a little book. And then I came home and came back and spent a year doing about 300 interviews. And it was just a great experience. I enjoyed it enormously. They were very hospitable. Almost anyone I asked to see agreed. It was astonishing. I can't imagine whether you could do that kind of a book in another country or not, but you certainly could with the British.
What parallels did you see in Britain that we are going through here in the United States?
Well, the interesting thing is now, the other day I picked up the New York Times, and there was an editorial on homelessness, and they were looking for all kinds of American reasons for homelessness, the raising of the lack of low-income housing and all these American reasons, specifically American reasons. But homelessness is practically the same in England proportionally to their population. We have about 4 million maximum. Nobody really knows, and they have about 1 million. France has the same, Italy. So certain things are happening in the post-industrial West all over that are very hard to explain. Another parallel is we are good in scientific research, but bad at applying it to products that sell worldwide, like the Japanese are good at that. We have social polarization. While doing the Britain book, I've also done one on the American Midwest, the farm crisis, or rural crisis. And there you find people are actually poorer in America than they were before. Whereas you don't find that in Washington or in the media, politics, science, up in Boston and Silicon Valley and everything. So our society, because of technology, is kind of dividing. The people who grow and make things, in other words, farmers and factory workers, are not doing very well in adjusting to the new technology, and the high-tech people and the communications people are doing extremely well. That's exactly what's happening in Britain. That's another parallel. What is not parallel, and the critical difference between, I think, Britain and ourselves, is that we have this feeling of opportunity, that in America you have the feeling you can really do anything if you try. The British don't feel that way. The majority of the population, I would say the working class and whatever, the north of England really, they've sort of given up. I mean, you'll get these astonishing interviews with young people saying, what's the use of learning a skill? What's the use of becoming a welder or whatever? I can't get a job. And this kind of apathy that is very distinctive to Britain.
What did you find are the major differences between our two countries?
Well, the biggest difference, of course, and the biggest affront to Americans, and I'm sure your other guest, Christopher Hitchens, will talk about this, is the class system, which we have, but not in such a distinctive way. Britain developed its present institutions in the middle of the 19th century to rule the empire. And essentially, this was to take a small percentage of the population, small number, and give them an excellent education. And so they created academic excellence at the cost of the population at large. So we don't have this system. What they did, they brought up people with talent and ability and brought them up through merit into the established hereditary upper class of power and money and culture. And this has worked very well for the British to rule the empire. It doesn't work now, and this is what's happening now. We don't have that system. Harvard does not dominate the United States in the manner that Oxford and Cambridge would, that sort of thing.
The book is called An American Looks at Britain. Our author guest is Richard Critchfield. Our other guest, Christopher Hitchens, we'll talk to in just a moment. But for the moment, we want to remind you that at the bottom of the hour, we'll go to phones, and our subject for this entire program will be Great Britain and how it relates to the United States. And the numbers are on your screen there, and you can begin dialing any time you want to. We're really anxious also to hear what you think about Question Time, the British House of Commons, which we run every Sunday night at 9 and midnight East Coast time. We've gotten a lot of reaction and letters and word of mouth, but we've never really talked about it on the air, and we've now been doing it for almost 7 months. Christopher Hitchens, your book is called Blood, Class, and Nostalgia. Mr. Critchfield just talked about the class thing. Why are Americans interested in royalty?
Well, I think it's partly because with a Republican system and an increasingly ceremonial presidency, one, in fact, the last incumbent of which was accused of being too ceremonial, of making it something altogether too monarchic, too symbolic, being only good, in other words, at that bit of the Constitution, that it's sort of inevitable that, as with any love-hate relationship, people are going to have a fascination with what they decided against, what, in fact, George Washington spent all his time overthrowing.
This is what the book looks like. One of the things I took you up on in the in your book was you talked about American magazines and the love affair with royalty. So I yesterday went to the bookstore to see in the magazine rack just to see if I could find any magazine, any at all. And as a matter of fact, the interesting thing, this morning's newspaper is hardly anything on Great Britain, which is unusual. This is the only magazine I could find, but it does make your point. And I wanted to ask you, this is M Magazine, which is put out by Fairchild Publications, owned by ABC Cap Cities.
I'm sort of surprised that was the only one you could find. It's quite rare to have nothing on the rack with Princess Diana's photograph on it. I mean, it's extraordinary to me that you can go into a supermarket or a newsstand and generally count on seeing her, and generally being put on the cover of a magazine means that those who are running the magazine bet that you know who that person is.
Will this
name and face recognition, in other words.
Will Prince Charles sell magazines?
Not to me, but then nor would his wife, but then I am a Republican, which is quite rare in Britain. I mean, a Republican in the sense of thinking Britain should be a republic. I read once that for the second year running, Princess Diana was the woman most photographed on the cover of American magazines.
This is one of the few times I didn't see anything anywhere except this magazine.
Well, still, that's not bad because there is the heir to the throne, as large as life, bold as brass. And there is, on the visits that, look, you see at that, probably no British paper would need to be any more servile, say, than that. It's as if he is your prince. The stuff is always flattering. It's always one-dimensional. It always assumes the automatic value and charm of monarchy. I simply do not understand why Americans need this. But my book is an attempt, perhaps I shouldn't say I don't understand it, since my book is an attempt to explain it, but shall I say I think there is a bit of a mystery there.
Mr. Critchfield, what's your reaction to not just this magazine, but the whole idea of so much attention being placed on royalty?
Well, Christopher said the article didn't appeal to him, but it would appeal to me. And I think that's the difference between an American and an Englishman. The coverage of Prince Charles in England itself is very critical, quite critical. But in America, you don't criticize the British royalty in the same way. And again, I wouldn't know exactly why this is so, but I suppose it's distance, that they don't, they have kind of a fairy tale quality to us, that Prince Charles, whether he succeeds or not, doesn't affect our lives or our society. It's once removed. We can enjoy them without worrying about the impact on American government and politics and that sort of thing.
You talk a lot about Winston Churchill, in a way different than what most Americans would think of him.
Yes, I had to be struck, living in Washington, quite early on in my time here, at how whenever a politician was in a tight corner or needed to justify some particularly egregious policy, they would generally go right into the brand tub and come out with a Churchill quotation. This took place on two levels. One, usually when some rather odd bit of American foreign policy had to be explained, such as, say, the invasion of Grenada or the decision to keep Marines in Beirut, they would always say, well, if we don't, this will be another Munich. In really exalted moments, there'd be references to Dunkirk and so on. But the whole idea of the grand struggle, the great world contest in which America was supposedly engaged, then known as the Cold War, was always justified by reference not to any American hero of the past or present, but always by reference to Churchill. And I thought it was interesting that they needed to borrow the sort of image of British grandeur for these moments. The second occasion on which you'd always get a Churchill quote was when a politician was on the way out and had been caught doing something horrible. And then, too, there'd always be Churchillian remarks about fortitude, personality, endurance, and so on. The addict in this case was always Richard Nixon, who was particularly addicted to, sorry, that's a repetition, particularly fond of resort to Churchillisms. And I think the lowest point yet reached on my Churchill account was by the defenders of Senator Tower when he was losing his nomination to be Secretary of Defense. You remember it was said that he drank a lot too much. And his defenders said, but Winston Churchill was on the brandy all the time and it didn't do him any harm at all. I thought there we'd really probably found the limit of Churchill exploitation.
Reaching again for a connection, and I want to ask you...
I quoted Churchill in my book very crucially in one place, which Churchill said, the antidote or the solution for Britain is science and democracy. More science, more democracy. In other words, an extension of the educational system, and particularly in science, to the broad masses. Well, to me, that's the answer for Britain, so I quote Churchill because he was right. In other words, I think a lot of the Churchill quoting is simply that Churchill was probably your most perceptive leader on many, many issues.
Well, no, but it's odd, though, you see, because the French don't always quote Churchill if they need an authority to appeal to, nor do the Italians, nor do a lot of other Western countries. The British don't quote him all that much, but in the United States it's an addiction. And some politicians like Caspar Weinberger have announced that this is their role model. Now, in part, obviously, I think it's because Churchill provides the moral authority for the Cold War. I mean, the speech he made at Fulton in the immediate post-war.
Fulton, Missouri?
Period, Fulton, Missouri, it's usually known as the Iron Curtain speech, provides the rhetorical basis for the Cold War, and his authority in having been the great leader against fascism provides the, if you like, the intellectual suggestion, which is essential for the Cold War, that the fight against communism is the same as the fight against Hitler was. And here you have in the same person the two struggles. what could be more handy? Plus a man who could always turn a good phrase and make a good speech.
Well, I think your book is very healthy because you're iconoclastic too, and somebody who the Americans have made a great icon, Churchill. And a lot of the things that you point out historically about him, his weaknesses, aren't commonly known in this country. I mean, there hasn't been an Englishman who sort of has gone after him the way you do in your book.
Well, it's generous of you to say. So, I mean, I think it's true that I've... but all I've done is emphasize things that actually Americans used to know about Churchill.
One of the things you
gave up knowing.
One of the things you write about in your book is the monuments around the country. If you go to Fulton, Missouri, there's a big, huge monument, a library type, or a building that's set aside with a statue of Winston Churchill at Westminster College because of the Iron Curtain speech. And you also mention New Orleans, but close to home here, and you mentioned, I think, Wisconsin, someplace where there's a monument, but close to home here. Tell the story about the British Embassy here and the flowers.
Yes, there's a big statue of Churchill, a bronze. It's high up on Mass Ave near the Naval Observatory where the Vice President officially lives. Beautiful tree-lined sweep of Massachusetts Avenue. There's a bronze of Churchill in his characteristic pose of making the victory sign and holding a cigar with the other hand. And on most mornings somebody puts a posy of flowers in the outstretched hand, which is sort of sculpted to receive them. And nobody knows who does this. The British Embassy swear it's not them. It's the local well-wishers. Yeah, and no one's ever seen it being done either. So there's a sort of local folklore about it. And that's a very good example, I think, of the sort of, what is the word I really need here, of the part fascination, but the real American naturalization of affection for Churchill. Of course, Churchill was a perfect example of the special relationship in some ways, in that he did have an American mother. And used to say that, you know, if he had an American father instead of an American mother, he might have got to Congress on his own.
Well, let's reach to this connection. Here's Newsweek. This is a small story, but here is Pamela Harriman, and it's a story about a telethon where she's going to raise $1.2 million for the Democratic Party, and she is the mother of Winston Churchill, which is the third, I guess he's the grandson of Winston Churchill, who was a member of the House of Commons.
Who was a correspondent out in Vietnam. I knew him some years ago. He was a reporter.
Oh, did you know me?
Go back to Mrs. Thatcher for a moment. You write that Britain was on the skids back in the late 70s, and she came along and may have saved it. I mean, you even quote David Owen, who's not in her party, as saying that
he hoped she'd saved it. The real problem with Mrs. Thatcher, and I admire a lot about her, is she really hasn't tackled the fundamental problems of Britain, which is the educational system. This would require a lot of investment in teachers and scientific labs and so on. When I was there, I went to Eton and the public schools, that is the private schools, and to a lot of generally true public schools in our sense, grade schools and high schools, and then to Oxford and Cambridge and what they call the polytechs. And there was a very sharp difference in the laboratory equipment and the general facilities between the private and the public. Eton and Winchester and a number of Westminster have invested a lot in scientific laboratories. I mean, built huge, massive new buildings and laboratories. So their children are really getting a leg up on scientific knowledge. Then you went to the polytechs, and they had pathetic laboratory equipment and everything. They didn't have enough capacity for the people that applied. For instance, Oxford has about 2,800 students, and the applicants are only twice that. There's a self-selection out.
On a class basis?
Well, it's hard to explain, but the polytechs, you'll have electronic engineering, and one, I'm thinking of Plymouth Polytech, had a class of 90, and they had like 3,000 applicants to get in there. So the educational plant of Britain is grossly inadequate for a high-tech scientific age.
Your opinion on Mrs. Thatcher?
Well, I think she's a national disaster, masquerading as the answer to a national disaster. But I think she genuinely has distinguished herself from the prime ministers who came before her by realizing something about the extent, at any rate, of the British crisis. I mean, I have to give her credit for recognizing that it was a crisis of the institutions, crisis of morale, and not just a crisis of the center, of the consensus, as people had thought of before. And obviously one has to give her credit for personal courage and matters of that kind. But I think she'll be remembered as an episode in the decline of Britain rather than as the answer to it.
We'll go to the phones in about 10 minutes. Richard Critchfield and Christopher Hitchens, both of you spent a lot of time on Rudyard Kipling. What's the connection? What's the reason?
The essential thing about Kipling is that he was the poet who popularized the idea of empire in America. That he did this for good propaganda reasons of his own, as well as because he was a very good poet, but that it was a self-conscious attempt on Kipling's part to interest America in the idea of taking on a world responsibility, a global imperial role, and sharing it with the British, and that his most famous line of poetry is "Take up the white man's burden." Probably the one phrase of Kipling that everybody knows, was written specifically in order to influence Congress, to take over the government of the Philippines in 1899.
Historically, this was very true. I'll give you, when I read that, I was terribly interested. I had an uncle who went out to the Philippines just after that, well, in 1905 as a school teacher, and he wrote bad Kipling colonial poetry, which was published in the Manila Press, imitations of Kipling, and it was the same thing. And he was a son of an Iowa minister, and he went out and immediately wrote back letters about the club and how the whites have to assume the problems of their little yellow charges and this sort of thing. Kipling had great influence at this time on educated Americans. Today, not.
I shouldn't blow my own trumpet, but on the other hand, I don't see why I shouldn't to this extent. I found in the archive of correspondence between Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, the wartime correspondence, 2 unpublished poems by Kipling, which I have now published in the book, both of which are also meditations on the imperial idea. Churchill gave these to Roosevelt by way, as far as I can see, of a warning, saying that if you want the British Empire, if you want to inherit it, as you seem to, just have some idea of what you're getting into.
One of these poems is quite anti-Semitic, isn't it?
Violently anti-Semitic.
Yeah, it's violently. It was quite a shock. That's why they may have never published it before.
Yeah, it's outstandingly so. I mean, I think myself that the reason Churchill was giving this to Roosevelt, because you have to ask why in the middle of a war Churchill would give as a personal present an anti-Jewish poem by Kipling to Roosevelt. I think it's a warning for the Americans to stay out of the British territories in the Middle East, and particularly the Mandate in Palestine.
Rudyard Kipling, by the way, as a way of background, was a turn-of-the-century 1900 close friend of Roosevelt, of Teddy Roosevelt?
Of Theodore Roosevelt, also, yes. Of the other Roosevelt, he was a particularly close friend. They had a long correspondence which went all through the First World War, on the German threat, on the Anglo-Saxon alliance, on the idea of an Anglo-Saxon world order, and on, the problems of colonial responsibility that the United States had begun to assume. Yes.
Kipling's wife was an American, and he lived for a long time in Vermont and wrote Jungle Book in Vermont. So he's definitely very much an Anglo-American figure.
Yeah.
Let's spend just a little time on asking you both about your books, and then try to connect this to today. And why in the world, I'm sure some people are tuning in saying, why are they talking about this? Normally we talk about the news on Monday. The news is a little slow on this summer. Actually, it's not quite summer day. It will be soon. How did you go about writing your book? You said you had 300 and some interviews.
Yeah, these are totally different books. Christopher knows Britain well, and therefore he did a lot of reading and research. I knew nothing about Britain, so I interviewed as many people as I could who did know British. And probably I interviewed maybe 150 sort of well-known Britons who are named in the book. And then probably that many people at random on trains and planes and pubs and wherever you, man in the street type of interviews.
Your best interview?
Well, 3, if I could name 3, and that would be David Owen, Norman Tebbit, and Tony Benn. Tony Benn's the extreme left. Norman Tebbit is very close to Mrs. Thatcher, and David Owen is the middle. Each of them gave me about 3 hours, and these were marvelous interviews.
Christopher Hitchens, how did you go about writing your book?
reading everyone else's book, copying out the useful bits as a sort of map, and then going to the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress is, of all the institutions I've struck since I came to America, not the only admirable one at all, but certainly the most admirable, the most helpful, the most democratic. And in there is a treasure trove of stuff. I worked on that. The Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, where I found the Kipling poems, is also a great place to go. And then, of course, a lifetime of experience.
You were born
into these things.
Where?
I was born in Portsmouth, UK, Portsmouth, Hampshire. I'm a Navy brat, and brought up in and around various naval towns. I went to university in Oxford, lived in London for a while. I've been here about 10 years. After a while, it seemed the next thing to do was to ruminate on the fact that wherever I turned, I saw either a picture of the British royal family or a quotation from Winston Churchill or a poem by Rudyard Kipling. I thought there must be some reason for this.
Are you...
And the, well, the book is an attempt to find out why it is that the British have this influence on the American imagination.
And are you still a British citizen?
Yeah.
And you're a permanent resident of the United States?
Permanent resident of the United States.
Do some work for Nation and Harper's?
That's right.
And
someone's got to do it.
Richard Critchfield, you're an American, born where?
I'm from North Dakota, very Midwestern background. My father was a country doctor out in the plains, Great Plains.
You spent about 10 years writing for the Washington Star when it was a newspaper.
Yes, I was in Vietnam 4 years for the Star, and most people would know from that, I suppose, here. But in the last, I went off in 1969, started doing the Third World, and I now write for The Economist and the Herald Tribune some, and the Christian Science Monitor. But one thing I want to be sure and get into on your show is Christopher, in a way, exemplifies the class system in Britain, and I hate to take him personally, but you're such a good example. When I went to Eton, the headmaster of Eton told me that the best education they gave them was what they called private business, that 4 or 5 of the boys every night, 2 nights a week, would go to one of the master's houses and talk only. Because what they wanted them to do is master the accent and the articulacy. And then again at Oxford and Cambridge both, they have the tutorial system where you write essays, 10 to 12-page essays on maybe 1 a week. Is that true?
Yes.
Very often, which again gives them written articulacy. So the British class system is essentially based on being able to speak with the right accent and being able to express take abstract thought and express yourself in the way that Americans aren't. Now, in our country, if you kind of fumble and are inarticulate, instinctively people think you're honest. You must get this on your shows with some politicians, where if somebody is extremely articulate, like Christopher, you immediately, the flags go up. They're too articulate. Why? What is this? And so it's a striking difference.
You have a very good chapter in your book, actually, about fluency in the language, and a fascinating talk with Steiner about all that.
George Steiner, yes.
Very
Before, we only have about 4 minutes before we go to the phones. You've been throwing around names that I want you to define or explain. Oxford, Cambridge, and Eton. What are they? Where are they? You graduated from Oxford.
In Britain, we have all kinds of ways of fooling ourselves and others about the class system and so on. And one of these is to call private fee-paying schools public schools. Eton is the most well-known private fee-paying forcing house for the ruling class. Produced, Richard, I think, has all the figures in his book, but an astounding number of recent prime ministers, members of parliament, and so forth, ambassadors, kind of thing. So that's Eton. It's just outside Windsor, very handy for the royal family and quite reasonably convenient for central London. It is said that the Battle of Waterloo was won on its playing fields. In other words, that it is the moral training ground for the ruling class. Oxford and Cambridge, well, one of them is an extremely good university, the other is a pretty good university. They're both medieval, and they both run on the college system, which means that you're a member of one college of the thing rather than of any body of scholarship, any educational system so defined.
So when you refer to Oxbridge, you're referring to what?
It's a very bad expression. I never use it.
It's a contraction of Oxford.
It suggests moral equivalence and should never be used.
All right. You get on a train in London, and how long does it take you to get to Eton, or how long does it take you to get to Cambridge and Oxford?
About an hour to each.
Yeah.
They're all different directions.
I'm going to go to the phones in a couple minutes. Relevance and what we're talking about to this country and to today. Richard, can you look at Great Britain and see anything happening there that we ought to be concerned about?
Yes, very much. Europe. Mrs. Thatcher should be getting into Europe far more than she's doing. If Britain wants to have relevance today, it's got to get into Europe and play its role to the hilt. And it's important to us that it do so because the British have given us all our great liberal institutions, and you've got this unified Germany emerging very strong and powerful that is not essentially a liberal nation in the way that the British are.
Christopher, what at all can we learn by watching Great Britain today?
I think what you will cease to have as much as you used to be able to count upon is the automatic playback of pro-American politics and public opinion that the British used to reliably provide for Washington. I think that aspect of the special relationship is going to go into a decline. The British ditto, in other words, is going to fade out. And what Richard correctly describes as the Europeanization of politics is going to be the central thing.
Time for the phones, and remember, if you care to speak about it, we'd like to know what you think of Question Time. Is it helping or hurting, or what's your reaction to it? Do you watch it? Stoneham, Massachusetts, go ahead, please.
Hello, yes, I've been banned at this station by Brian Lamb for the past 2 years.
And you're banned now. Sorry that we had to, we have a 30-day policy, and that's a gentleman who has been violating it for years. But this is the occupational hazard.
He was very loud.
Yes, he was. Quickly, before we take the next call from either one of you, have you seen Question Time on this network? And I know you've seen it over in Great Britain. And what do you think of us covering it? Is it helping or hurting us better understand the Brits?
Oh, helping considerably. It's good, excellent.
I mean, some people criticize it and think it's not a good reflection of what really goes on over there.
Oh, I found people are very impressed by it, and that they have a wistful feeling that they'd like to see the president get put through the mill like that every now and then by Congress too. You know, Abraham Lincoln was under real pressure during the Civil War to have a Question Time session on the Hill, where the president would have to come and account for himself, and fought very hard against the idea. I think it's a pity that he did, because there are so many presidents who could have benefited by 20 minutes or so a week of knock down, drag out.
Do you have the House of Lords? Do you show them also?
We have. We don't. We haven't done much of it lately, but it's also interesting to watch.
If you're an American writing a book about Britain, I found both of these marvelously informative to follow, because you're there and you don't get that feeling in the press.
Lexington, Kentucky. Let's take our first call. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, how you doing?
Good.
My question for your guest is, as an American citizen, I find it pretty fascinating sometimes how the American government is continually trying to find us a new hobgoblin. For a while it might have been Castro, and that kind of fizzled out, and then the mighty legions of Daniel Ortega were going to come up through Texas, and that kind of fizzled out. Now I guess it's drugs. I was wondering if the British government feels the same necessity to give the British citizens some evil hobgoblin to be afraid of.
Christopher?
I know what you mean, and I think the answer is no. The fact is that though the British are an island race, and it's always been easy to make them close ranks against outsiders, there hasn't for some time now been the search for upstart scapegoats of the sort you mentioned. Not, I think, since the country went mad in 1956 and decided that if it didn't invade Egypt, that no one would ever speak to us again, or we'd never be able to look anyone else in the eye. Well, the thing that's remembered is the Suez War, which was a great calamity, and out of which came a certain amount of education.
I think if there is a scapegoat, it's us in Britain. I mean, the Americans are kind of, if something happens, it's kind of the Americans are now doing this. There's definitely an attitude of kind of blaming Americans for a lot of things going on.
Reagan would be picking on someone our own side.
Reagan was terribly unpopular in England. I was amazed to go to Oxford and Cambridge and find that he was probably the most unpopular president we ever had. And this kind of warmth, the kind of charisma that Reagan exercised in this country was totally absent in Britain.
But when you say he was unpopular at Oxford and Cambridge, is that unpopular in the country?
Well, to a certain degree, yes, because Oxford and Cambridge, very importantly, control the media of Britain. It's like Harvard and Yale control the media of America. It's a totally different thing. We don't have it. Where your very well-educated, upper-class people would actually go into television and filmmaking and the rest.
San Diego, you're next.
Yes, good morning. I'd like to ask the gentleman, both of them, two questions each. One, in your research, what have you discovered in relationship to Rudolf Hess, and who was, as you know, imprisoned in Spandau for so many years? And the second question would be the involvement of the English influence in world conflicts. There's been much controversy about both of these particular questions.
Chris?
I didn't do much on Hess. And I once read a fascinating but rather crazy article that suggested that the guy who died in Spandau was the wrong guy. And I know that it's a subject that magnetizes a certain kind of phone call. Usually the sort of phone call, in fact, that goes on then to ask an impossible second half, like, what about the British and world conflict? I can't really think of that.
As a way of dealing with some of the world and the conflict, at its highest point, or I'm not sure that's the phrase you use, but when the British had their empire worldwide, name several places where they controlled.
Well, first and foremost, India, of course, Kenya. The British Empire was based on, so you had the Industrial Revolution come first, and they had to have markets. So the British Empire was really based on trade and keeping trade routes open. So they had to send soldiers out to keep all their ports going. And then finally this led to annexation. And then in the Kipling period, the 19th century, you actually had a land grab by all these European powers, just getting countries for the sake of being larger and having greater empires. But that wasn't the original intention. The original intention was simply to protect their trade.
Besides India, others?
India, South Africa, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, large parts of China, Nigeria, and most of the rest of West Africa, Uganda, and quite a lot of East Africa. Egypt, not formally actually annexed to the empire, but certainly governed by the British, yes. Most of the islands in the Mediterranean along the way through to the Suez Canal, most of the princely states on the way through the Gulf, on the way to India, chain all the way along, Burma, Malaya. Quite a lot. We used to be told it was the empire in which the sun never set. Its opponents in Britain, like Ernest Jones, the great Chartist leader, would say, yes, and the empire in which the blood never dries. I'm old enough to remember sitting in a schoolroom where, you know, the centerpiece of every schoolroom's decoration was a large map of the world, with most of it inked in red. That was ours.
I'd like to just add
the loss of it is still something the British haven't come to terms with. But what is really noticeable about all those countries is that, with very few exceptions, they now form part of the problems of American foreign policy. It shows the direct line of succession between the British Empire and the American Empire that I argue for in my book.
But I would like to say, Christopher, that I spent, 20 years or so living in the Third World, and I find the after effect of empire in practically every place you've named I've been, and very often live in villages, and I find it's practically all to the good. It's amazing. One time I was in Sudan in a remote court in the Nuba Mountains, and a cattle thief was being tried, and he said, "You can't try me, I'm from another tribe." And the judge held up this pathetic, tattered old law book. It was the English colonial laws, and saying the law is the law no matter where and whatever. And then once in Dhaka, I was in a riot, and my Bengali interpreter, who was kind of aghast at what was happening, turned to me and he said, "My father read Macaulay and wore a suit and tie every day of his life." In other words, the sun really hasn't set. I mean, all over the world today, there are repercussions and echoes of the British Empire.
I must say both of your stories make one proud to be British, and I think there are some good legacies to it. Notably, of course, the English language, which I think is a great international language.
Chappaqua, New York, you're next.
Hi, I'm finding your conversation very fascinating as a recent tourist to Britain. I have a rather simplistic question to ask. We found the British all over England, not just London, very anti-American. They could almost see us walking down the street. We even had trouble getting lunch in Bath because they seemed to know we were sitting at a table and no one came over to serve us. We finally got up and walked out. Is this common? I think Mr. Critchfield answered the question in a way by saying they blame us for so many of the problems. Is this a common thing?
It could be two things. One is, if you went in June or July, they're just so inundated by tourists that they get very jaded about tourists. But the other thing is something more serious, which I found in Surrey, and it's not anti-Americanism, it's sort of anti-peopleism. There's kind of a hostility or an alienation among large numbers of Brits. And I think that there's a reason for this, that they haven't gotten over the fall of empire, and this is a tremendous psychological shock. And you're watching a society go through the healing process of trauma, really. I mean, they're getting over, they have to find a new role. As Dean Acheson said, they've lost their empire but haven't found a role. And I think that's happening in Britain. When they do, I think they'll bounce back and be the same old British and be very dominant on the world scene. But I think it's going to take time.
I'm so appalled to think that could happen to a visitor to Bath. It just means that there must have been a great slippage of standards since I was there. But bear in mind, though, that there's a certain standard of rudeness that the British observe among themselves as well as to foreign guests. And they may not mean anything specifically about you by it. In other words, an English visitor might have fared no better.
Carson City, Nevada. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. This question is primarily directed to Mr. Hitchens. I noticed when Brian was interviewing the labor members of Parliament back when they started broadcasting Parliament, that they were awful dismissive of Winston Churchill's accomplishments and also especially of American idolatry of him. I wondered if the British have a cynical view of how the Americans regard Winston Churchill.
Well, I think some of us do. I certainly would argue that we do and should, and I have a chapter about it in my book. I think the reason for that probably is that though Churchill's remembered with appropriate respect in Britain, he was also a party politician there in a way that he wasn't here, or isn't remembered here. Even during the war, he was the leader of the Conservative Party as well as the leader of the government. He actually was the leader of a coalition. But as soon as the war was over, he fought and lost the election on the Conservative Party manifesto. It was at the moment of his victory, dismissed from office by an electorate that could tell the difference between him and his party, in other words.
When was he a member of the Labour Party?
He was never a member of the Labour Party. He was a member of the Liberal Party. And Richard may have to help me out here. I can't tell you the exact year when he crossed the floor, but it was before the First World War, at any rate. So he was, yes, he was a famous turncoat, in fact, as well as being a party politician. He'd been a member of two parties.
If he were a politician, based on what you know about him today in the United States, what party would he belong to, and what faction of the party would he?
It's a very interesting question.
That's a hard one, because you'd first say Republican, but not in terms of internationalism.
No.
The Democrats. It doesn't work very well with the Republicans and Democrats, because the Democrats are your international party and your Republicans are your conservatives.
The reason I ask is that do you find people here standing up and saying great things about him because they think that he thought like they do, or because they like what he said, or what he did?
Generally speaking, he's used as an image of military conservatism, let's say. I think that's a pity, myself, because I think he was grander than that. But he was generally used as a reinforcement of conservative views on defense, for example.
Age important? Caspar Weinberger or Bill Casey were World War II types. And see, I was talking to Bill Bundy the other day, and he had been at Bletchley, which was the code-breaking center. He worked there with all these Englishmen that I later interviewed for the book. And this was kind of a closeness between the British and the Americans that you simply don't have today.
Look, in my book, though, I described going to the Winston Churchill Award dinner in Los Angeles, where Prince Philip gave the Winston Churchill Award to his eternal shame to Ronald Reagan. Mm-hmm. Also, at this huge dinner in L.A., a prize is given by the Los Angeles Times, which is an annual essay competition, with its subject is Winston Churchill.
Uh-huh.
And the guy who won it, the boy who won it that year, was from El Toro High School.
Well,
now, you couldn't be further away from the WASP Anglo connection than Los Angeles, California, and yet that's the subject on which the LA Times sponsors an essay competition for school.
Mr. Critchfield mentioned Bill Bundy. He's the former editor of Foreign Affairs magazine, and he is quoted on the back of your book on the jacket saying, "An unforgettable portrait of late 20th century Britain."
He helped me a lot on the. There's one chapter toward the end, into the 21st century, which was we had to deal right as this book was coming to press. All the events of Eastern Europe happened. So from November to February, we had to keep updating the book day by day. It was a mess.
When did you write your last word for this book?
February 15. So it was very recent, you see.
When did you write the last word for your book?
Oh, sometime in September in Charlottesville, Virginia.
New York City, go ahead, please.
Oh, hello. I wanted to say that Thursday night at the House of Commons is, I'll take it over Saturday Night Live anytime, but one of the reasons is when you have so many congressmen or senators like, what's his name, Uriah Hatch, who are fawn over the executive branch, and I find the irreverence of the members of the House of Commons exhilarating, and the more scathing they are, the more I enjoy it. But does it really mean anything? I mean, does it really make a substantial difference in the way the government functions, and in fact that they challenge her that directly? And I wanted to comment that I think there is a difference between the way an articulate English person in public life and the use of language of our managerial political class. It seems to me that Americans who are supposedly educated and articulate use language in a much more vague and blunted way and speak in jargon, whereas at least it seems to, from my limited exposure to them, the British people just seem to use English, are direct and clear. And I wonder if, and I think that use of language that our managerial class has, standard guests on McNeil Lair, and is very off-putting to the majority of the working classes and the relatively uneducated lower middle classes, because they feel excluded from it, and it's meant to obscure rather than to clarify.
Okay, Christopher.
Very good question, actually. I mean, on the both halves of it. Look, on the parliamentary question time, it's essential, it seems to me, that people realise that Harold Macmillan, the allegedly unflappable, imperturbable Conservative Prime Minister of the 50s, used sometimes to have to go and be sick. He was so nervous before going in to face question time. You are simply thrown to the lions for 20 minutes. You may be in charge of the country the rest of the week. During those 20 minutes, you've got to answer any question that's asked you. Excuse me. You've got to face all the barracking they can throw at you, and you've got to do so without a teleprompter. And if you're caught lying in the course of anything, you say you have to resign. Another reform, I think, that would be a good one to implement.
If you're caught lying.
You lie to the House of Commons. You have to, and you're proved to have done so.
Ever
That's
happened?
It. Oh, yeah, sure. Ministers have had to resign for that. No prime ministers had to. Other ministers have to face this process, too.
What about her second point, Richard?
So,
Well, okay, well, I just wanted to say, I think the debates in the House of Commons are theater. They reflect the way that British articulacy works, and that British conversations are often like a tennis game. They don't, Americans feel words in a debate in the House of Commons or which should end in a consequence or a purpose. The British don't necessarily feel that way. They think about whether the expression, is it being expressed well, is it being said well, and whatever. So when you watch the House of Commons, you're not really watching something that affects what's going to happen in the government the way you would in an American congressional debate. It's kind of theater. You have to kind of keep that in mind. And then this lady had very good remarks. I thought she was an example of American articulacy. And when she said that the British speak directly and clearly, and Americans tend to obfuscate and whatever, I think there's a very good point. But I think the reason they do it, I think the British have learned to think clearly and abstractly, and therefore they can put it into words. Where we're confused more. It has something to do with being such a big country. We need more evidence. We're unsure. And therefore, we don't have this ability to put it all in a clear, concise, trenchant way the British do.
We will be coming to you live from another great island in this world, and that is the island of Japan, next Sunday night at 9:30 East Coast time with a live call-in show. We'll tell you more about that as the week goes on, and actually it'll be Monday morning in Japan, but it'll be Sunday night here in America. Let's go to Yuma, Arizona. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian.
Morning.
Appreciate the discussion.
Thank you.
I want to ask a question about an island which was one of the main possessions of the British in the Mediterranean, namely Cyprus. It was an island which suffered an invasion from the Turks in 1974, and there's been an immense loss of life and terrible devastation of its Greek heritage, which reaches back to 1500 BC. And I'm wondering if your guests feel that perhaps Britain, as a guarantor of Cypriot independence, might have handled or reacted to the Turkish invasion of 74 in a different way.
Chris Hitchens?
Well, yeah, my God, I should have brought my other book. I wrote a book about all this. No, I shouldn't plug another one, should I? About Cyprus. Yes, look, I mean, I think it's Cyprus's British problem goes back before 1974. The British were the colonial authority in Cyprus for nearly 100 years, and in the course of that, pitted Greeks and Turks against one another in what used to be called the method of divide and rule. So in a sense, the original reason for the quarrel arises from the fact that Cyprus was a British colony and administered as such. By 1974, it's in a sense too late to do anything about the quarrel. The quarrel's underway, but Britain was completely unwilling to abide by its treaty obligations to the island, which has no defense forces of its own, and has let the Turks impose partition on it by force. So that while all the other boundaries in Europe are coming down, there is a barbed wire boundary right across the middle of the capital city of Cyprus, Nicosia, and it's drawn by a NATO army and paid for by American tax money. And it stands now as the outstanding anomaly of the European political and military scene.
Comment, Richard?
Yes. The British military leaders that I talked to, Field Marshal Lord Carver, the former head of the armed forces, he said that Cyprus is one of their last remaining imperial outposts, but it's terribly important because it's a big intelligence listening post. And it's important. And I think Sir Anthony Ackland here, the British ambassador, mentioned, we were talking about the British role today, and the important thing that the British still do is provide intelligence and share it with the Americans, and Cyprus is vital in that role.
You say in your book that Sir Anthony Ackland, the ambassador from Great Britain to the United States, read a couple of your chapters for you in the book?
We were all at a party the other night together, in fact.
You two and others?
Yes.
Have you read each other's book?
Yes, we have.
Yes, we have.
I hesitate, should ask you to critique each other's book. Let's go to Orlando, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Two quick ones. One technical on question time, which I really enjoy. What does Thatcher mean when she says, I refer the gentleman to the answer I gave some moments ago, even when it seems like she hasn't even heard the question yet?
Did you notice that before she does that, the speaker, that Mr. Speaker says the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, every question time, usually they get up to as many as 8 numbers. And basically, the question laid down on the table is a simple question, like, what are you going to do for the rest of the day? Because they don't want to telegraph, if I understand it correctly, to the members, to Mrs. Thatcher, what they're going to ask her. So she dismisses that first question as she does. Chris?
Yeah, you're supposed to get up and say, would the Prime Minister please tell us if she has any plans to visit Nottingham? And she says, well, either I've answered that already, or I might be going to Nottingham at the end of the month. Then you, as your supplementary, say, well, if the Prime Minister went to Nottingham, is she aware of the fact that everyone there would tell her that her policy on the poll tax is bringing ruin, shame, and disgrace to widows and orphans? And she doesn't know that's what you're going to say. She's got to answer that on her feet. It's just a convention that allows the backbencher to get a chance at the prime ministerial throat. Thatcher's got very good at fending them off, actually.
Follow-up question, Orlando?
Yeah, my other was, your guests have talked a lot about the elites in Britain, but what about the underclass? I mean, from a distance, it seems to be growing and becoming a crisis. Is this because of Thatcher's policies, or is anything being done about it? Which isn't to say we don't have one here, but I just...
Richard?
It's partly because of Thatcher's policies, but it goes much deeper, and probably for the same reasons that you're getting an underclass here. It's the same kind of, it's another parallel. It's strange social change that's taking place in Europe and America, and we can't blame Thatcher for it. What she has done, I would say Mrs. Thatcher has one major flaw as a political leader. She is utterly lacking in compassionate or imagination when it comes to people who don't have much, say the lower half of the society. Well, not the lower half, because see, you have to know about Mrs. Thatcher that she has about 45% of the electorate who are ex-working class, lower middle class, people who are doing well today. And they vote her back every time, and they will continue to no matter what happens. But the people below that, the workers, the people that haven't adjusted, are really being left out of British society. And you travel around the north, you find a large minority of Britain who are an underclass and are confined to these ghastly, what we don't have in our country. All around the northern British cities, there are vast housing projects. And for instance, in Glasgow, there are 11, and in one, which I visited in the suburbs of Glasgow, called Easter House, you had 17,000 people. Now, they're way out of the city, they're trapped, the bus is expensive to go back and forth, most of them jobless, a lot of them are drugs, a lot of crime. It's a terrible, terrible problem that British faces.
What was your percentage on the amount of wealth held by a very small percentage of the British people? One of you gave this.
I think I gave it, but I can't remember offhand, but it's very
It used
pronounced.
to be 7% of the population owned 84% of the wealth. That was the last time I checked.
Oh, yeah. 84%?
Seven in one.
Yeah,
Yeah, seven own 84.
There's a famous theater group called 784 based
That's
on
probably
this.
how I
Yeah,
remember
that's how they
it,
got
yes.
their name. Yeah.
Just should, in my book, I mentioned Evelyn Waugh and a wonderful Anglo-American novel he wrote called The Loved One, in which it's asked, why are all British people in America somehow automatically part of the elite? You know, how do they manage that? And one of the old knights just arguing says, of course, you never meet an Englishman among the underdogs. So except in England, of course.
Muskegon, Michigan. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning.
Morning.
Thank you. I wanted to say, first of all, that I really appreciate having comments on, but in the other way of looking at it, it's a little bit frightening, because I think Americans, we're provincial, really, and we don't know enough about comparative government. So it seems to me that the combativeness of the process brings a little superficiality to it. And I think that's dangerous for Americans, and I think that we don't understand really enough of the party system, the party loyalty in England as compared to the lack of party loyalty in America's congressional system. I think, too, that Mr. Critchfield's mentioning the difference in the numbers. Some of my students, I taught comparative government, and they had no idea of the numbers of people that a person in Commons represents as compared to the responsibility of a person in our House of Representatives, or in a state such as Michigan, where our senators have a constituency of 9 million people. And I think the debate level is witty and kind of brilliant, but really their homework is often weak, and their committee system, I think, isn't as good as ours.
Okay, I think you made a lot of good points, and some of the things we've tried to deal with on this network, including the simple fact that there's 525,000 in an American representatives constituency, and that's not voters, but in Brits' constituency, somewhere around 70,000.
Yeah, more like 70 to 100. Well, in some cases up to 100.
And we
it's true, yes.
And we have and will carry more of the hearings on this network, just as we continue to try to do the comparative government thing. You took a deep breath there.
She said they don't seem to have done their homework. Well, I don't know how many staffers U.S. Senator has, but 8. I was astonished to go first interview Dennis Healy, who was in a little closet. He was the shadow foreign secretary at the time, and there was him, his assistant, and some cardboard boxes, and that was it. It was tiny. Then I interviewed Brian Gould, the labor trade spokesman, and his only staff was his wife, who was on the phone and whatever. Whatever a member of British Parliament...
You could tell, too, from his speeches.
They keep whatever they know in their head, you see. In other words, they don't have... occasionally, I will speak to something called the Congressional Staff Speakers Forum here, which is every expert of every congressman, senator on the third world. You never talk to the senator or congressman. They have all these specialists. The British Parliament, they're on their own. It's marvelous.
I guess people already know this, but you know, there isn't room. If every member of Parliament turns up for the same debate, there isn't a seat for all of them to sit down. I mean, in fact, that would leave at least 150 of them standing. And that's on purpose. And when the chamber was destroyed by the Nazis during the Second World War, it was ordered to be rebuilt in exactly the same way. So the atmosphere of a full chamber and real party political combat would always be the same. And never mind the fact that there isn't room for all our legislators to sit down. What I think I most miss by living here, and I agree with the lady that the British committee system's no good and the American hearings are a lot better, is simply the idea of the word partisan. I can't stand the fact that in American political discussion the word bipartisan is used to mean automatically very good. Everyone trying to agree, everyone wanting to think and say the same thing. And that one of the worst things you can say to somebody is they're taking a partisan view, as if we go on like this, before we know where we are, we'll have two parties. In other words, a one-party state mentality enforced in the sort of consensus talk and babble that the lady earlier on, who was criticizing McNeil-Lehrer type programs, correctly identified. The reason those people are so boring and nauseating to listen to is they're trying to talk from everybody's point of view, and they haven't got the courage to have one of their own.
Some comparative numbers. There are 650 members, I believe, in the British House of Commons, 435 in the U.S. House of Representatives. A House member has 18 staff people on average, and a member of Parliament has 1.5 persons.
Is that what it is? 1.5 average?
Something like that. 1 to 2 people, depending.
You don't find anybody with them ever.
And a lot of their support and research are American college students who act as interns. Honolulu, Hawaii. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
Good morning.
I have a two-part question. First, really, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the possible relationship and how it will develop between America and the UK after Europe becomes a single power bloc. It appears to me that there is extreme ambiguity both in Britain's position on becoming part of the EEC and America's reaction to this, illustrated mostly by the fact that every time American media cover European news stories, they put up a little logo just above the talking head, which usually has a map of Europe, which unfortunately doesn't seem to have an island off it.
Okay, I think we get your point. In other words, Great Britain's not on that. What do either one of you think?
There are two. I found two schools of thought in London. Thatcher, Norman Tebbit, her party, her kind of Tory want to retain the special relationship as it is today. Generally, the British establishment, the Oxford and Cambridge people and so on, the non-military, non-defense establishment, and particularly the Foreign Office, believe the future of Europe, future of Britain lies with Europe. And above all, Michael Heseltine, who is probably Mrs. Thatcher's most likely successor. So Britain will go with Europe, but it'll go with Europe after Thatcher.
See on our table here 2 books, and our 2 guests have written these books. You can find them in your bookstores. An American Looks at Britain, Richard Critchfield, who is an American, and Blood, Class, and Nostalgia by Christopher Hitchens, who is a British citizen. Beverly Hills, California, go ahead, please.
Hi. I recently read a concept that I'd like your guest to comment upon, and it goes something like this. That the American over-involvement, if you believe in that, around the world is a direct result of the British ruling class through their secret service, getting our secret service to take the place of the British Empire with American money. That is, they encouraged us to get over-involved to maintain British markets around the world and preserve their position in class.
Chris Hitchens.
I hope you read that what I think you could have done, which would be in the pages of this most excellent book that Brian was just so kindly holding up. I mean, look, yes, it's true. I mean, the idea of a national intelligence agency with huge global powers was a very foreign one to America until the 1930s. And when war came, they found they hadn't got any such agency. And it was really cut entirely from the British cloth originally, the OSS, which became the CIA. It was exclusively done with British advisors and based on the British experience. And yes, it was the British hope that this larger agency would pull British chestnuts out of the fire around the world, which it did do and has done as well. But on the whole, it went off on its own with bigger ideas and supplanted the the elderly cousin who'd given it its start in life.
If you're watching this live, the House of Commons in Canada will welcome Nelson Mandela, where he'll give a speech at 11 a.m. East Coast time this morning. And I want to ask Richard, one of the things that's always interesting is when you find out that Great Britain invests more money in this country than the Japanese.
$70 billion, yes.
Where's all that money go?
It goes into property, real estate mainly. Mrs. Thatcher has allowed this. This doesn't mean the British are so rich. It means that the British are investing their money in a safer place than Britain. Instead of putting their money into British firms and factories and things that would help the economy of Britain, they're getting it out into assets. Just as the rich English tend to buy paintings. You go to Sotheby's and Christie's, are buying these huge, jacking up the price of Picasso and all this. This is an old British custom. It's also an old Japanese custom, that when you have money, you put it into land and paintings, you put it into assets. And they happen to be putting money into a lot of assets in this country because it's safe.
Kissimmee, Florida, you're next.
I would like to make a question about, besides the theatricals of the language, of the English language spoken in England, I think there is an idea. Any English who like to find out if there is a superficiality, they speak Latin American. And if you, in the United States, mainly, my students, for example, think that there is something substantial to say, should be spoken in the good English way. I wonder if that is a right approach or a wrong one, you know? Because sometimes people think that in the only way to make something substantial and strong is spoken like in the House of Commons, for example.
Where are you, caller, where are you from originally?
Sorry?
Where are you from?
I am a Peruvian, sir. I am a teacher and a PhD, a former student of London University.
And do you teach in Peru? I mean,
no, I've never taught, I'm afraid, in Peru, sir. I've been lecturing in London and lecturing in the United States, but I've never had a chance to taught in Peru, I'm afraid.
All right, thanks. Chris?
Well, I could certainly tell you'd spent some time in the old country, and I think it's undoubtedly true that people who talk like me are thought by some to have been better educated. I just want you to know that it's not true.
Richard?
I have one comment on that. Mrs. Thatcher has had elocution lessons and speaks in a rather stilted, artificial way, according to the British. You wouldn't notice it so much in this country, but in London, everybody knows this.
Excruciating voice, yes.
And yes, that voice, they all say. And so I asked some of her staff, actually, why doesn't she speak in her provincial accent that she was born with up in Grantham? And they said that this is part of the class system, that she wouldn't, her price of being prime minister is to speak like Christopher.
It's said of the British, I forget by whom, but well said, that we're all branded on the tongue, and that you can tell much too much about someone's social origins, and so from the moment they open their mouth, straight away.
It's a way
of
keeping control. You see, everybody in Britain, when they meet a Christopher, you're a perfect example. You know that in the North they know that you're part of the ruling group, and it's kind of establishes.
If only that was true, I keep thinking. I mean, it just gives. It means I get the name without the game.
If you were a member of Parliament in Great Britain, what party would you belong to?
I would be a member of the Labour Party.
And what side? I mean, where in the spectrum of the Labour Party?
I would be closer to Tony Benn than to any other Labour politician anyone's likely to have heard of. That's to say, I'd be on the left of the Labour Party, except that I quarrelled with Benn and with his supporters over the matter of British membership of Europe. I was always in favour of British membership of the common market.
Today we're celebrating our 50 millionth home. C-SPAN plugs into Falmouth, Massachusetts, in honor of our sister city over in Great Britain.
Absolutely.
And we will show you a little bit of our 50 millionth person that's been designated to be our 50 millionth person to get home to get it, Christine Fortin, and she's a high school teacher in Falmouth. Let's go back to the phones. Carson City, Nevada again. Go ahead, please.
Hello, I love this British guy, brogue. It reminds me of my tailor's expression back in West Cork in Ireland. He says he speaks well dressed. But it was always my understanding that these questions to Mrs. Thatcher, that they had to be previously submitted, because she's always very well prepared. She's got her books in front of her, and I thought there was this tradition of putting down a question for the Prime Minister, that she was in effect never taken by surprise?
Well, there are questions that are submitted in writing for the Prime Ministerial answer, yes, and there are questions that she can't get to in the question time that are answered in writing, but it's still the case that she has to stand up and take her chances.
Neil Kinnock doesn't tell her in advance what he's going to ask her.
No, he doesn't. Nor he doesn't have to tell the Speaker either. I mean, that is the supposed beauty of it. It's because she's better at it than Kinnock is that she's still ahead in the polls.
And she's still ahead in the polls?
Well, she's still ahead. Sorry, let me say she's ahead of him in the of Labour in the polls. She's ahead of Kinnock in the polls.
I mean, personally?
Yes. I mean, in other words, Kinnock is less popular than his party.
Quick question. Guess what will happen if she stands for election again?
She'll be re-elected.
Richard?
She'll be re-elected. By this minority of the British that have re-elected her 3 times. In other words, she won't be elected by a majority of the British people. She will be elected by a lower middle class group that are fanatically pro-Thatcher, thick and thin.
Got what, 40-some% of the vote?
She got 43 last time, but it varies 40 to 45% in all 3 elections.
Buffalo, New York next. Go ahead, please.
Excuse me.
Good morning, Byron. I'm anxious to know what is the 2 gentlemen, they've done extensive interviewing, and I would assume that the Irish question will have to be eventually solved, and it's been going on for so many years, but I feel that the British people themselves will see the futility of it, of keeping a large army of occupation there continually, and some of the British justice system has broken down. They convicted one man that spent 10 years in prison, and he was later, just within the last month or 2, he's been released because it showed a gross malfeasance in office by the prosecutor, who it went up to the I don't know who would be analogous or homologous with your Attorney General here in the United States, but he was the one that did some of the original prosecuting.
Richard, I think we got his question.
I think the British people do see the futility of it, and that's not the point. Everybody in Britain more or less wants out of Northern Ireland. They would like to have Northern Ireland be part of Ireland.
Did you spend time there when you wrote your book?
Yes, and interviewed people. And the Protestant majority, which is a slight majority, it's like 60-40, no one can abandon them. And they don't want to be part of Ireland. So it's just a problem that at the moment is not solvable. And the Americans, and particularly the Irish Americans, should realize this and accept it and remain detached. I mean, for him to say, this man, our viewer is slightly incorrect when he said the British people will realize someday the futility. They do now. They just don't know a way out.
By the way, we mentioned earlier we're going to be in Japan on Sunday Night Live, and we're taping a lot of other programs, and over a period of about 4 weeks we're going to focus on Japan. On Sunday evenings, those times will be available to you as we go down the road. We've been spending a lot of time over in Europe, and it's now time to look the other way, and you might be interested that they are trying to start a C-SPAN in Japan. They've created a company called CNET, and they're using some of our American C-SPAN product as a way to introduce the idea of coverage of hearings and the House of Representatives and the Senate in Japan, and we'll tell you again more about that later. Munich, Germany, our next call. Go ahead, please.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good morning.
I've just been listening to you, and our English guest there, I won't read his book, I can assure you. The American one, possibly, yes. But frankly, it's been the best comedy show that I've ever listened to.
Yes, on with it.
With regard to comments about Great Britain. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Gentleman doesn't want to complete.
He doesn't want to do it.
Why do you think he would call this a
I'd
comedy?
hate to see a fellow countryman of mine funk a question like that. I mean, to, as it were, try and be rude and then run away. And from Munich, too. Shocking performance. Don't know. I mean, I think we should just spare his blushes and move on.
Who was it? I mean,
I think it's a stray soccer hooligan just trying to fight his way home through the beer halls.
Oh.
Iowa Park, Texas. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian.
Morning.
I'm delighted with the esteem of your 2 guests that you had this morning, especially Mr. Hitchens. I've always wanted to catch him on one of your call-ins. I've got a question. You're talking about class. Okay, I'm interested in like consumer markets, products that are bought by consumers, and how in America we've always had a very diverse economy, and people can buy discount or they can buy name brands. There are different levels of you understand what I mean? Well, I've been concerned with the way that the trade blocks are coming into being, and if he would like to comment on what he views as the future trends, and if it will remain as diverse, or if the possibility of, for example, monopolies, coming into. It's kind of hard to. Do you get the idea of what I'm talking about?
I feel really terrible, since you say you've been looking forward to seeing me on one of these shows, that I can't understand the grammar of your question. I can't help you out.
Caller, what are you're talking about?
And I say that it has to do with class, or not yet, at any rate.
Well, I could give you an example. Okay, for instance, if there were 10 people in the world, okay, and there's somebody making bread, and he decides, well, I can sell a loaf of bread for $1 a loaf. Everybody in the world can afford one. I make $10, I make 10 loaves. Then he gets on his computer and he figures out, hold it, 5 people can pay $5 for a loaf of bread. I make 5 times the money, make half as much bread, and forget the other 5 people.
How does that relate to the British question and the 1992 in Europe?
Well, I might have misunderstood. I thought that you were talking about like class distinctions, and I wanted to see if he might like to comment of how it might be reflected in the marketplace. And
okay, I'm not sure. Do you?
I think I have to do a pass on this.
Let me ask both of you before we grab this next call. I'm sorry to our caller. I guess we just didn't understand. Your favorite Brit?
My favorite Brit?
Your favorite Brit?
I'd say David Owen.
David Owen is your favorite Brit as you interviewed him for this book?
Yes.
Will he ever be a leader in Great Britain again?
No, he's the lost prince. He's lost his party. He has nowhere to go. If the Labour Party, David Owen, we should explain, was the former foreign secretary under Callahan. He broke off and formed his own party, the Social Democrats, which has practically no vote in the last few elections.
Which has dissolved itself.
Yeah, and so
not a minute too soon.
Yeah. He's the Hamlet of the piece.
Okay,
he's moderate and intelligent.
Your favorite Brit?
Tom Paine.
No, live Brit. I think that's, if we're doing historical figures.
Tom Paine, the greatest Englishman and the greatest American.
Pasadena, California.
Hi, Brian.
Hi.
I think you have someone there who might be likely to give you a John Hall update. You never know.
Christopher Hitchens, yes.
Oh, Matt.
Chris Hitchens would, if he's kept up, might do it. He seems to be the mystery character that's weaving a thread through all the call-in shows. Mr. Hitchens, I'm concerned about the secrecy in England and why the English put up with it, and how a prime minister, once in power, is almost an elected dictator and can sit on her own secrets. She doesn't have to release anything. And could you possibly discuss the difference in pressure groups and why constituencies or pressure groups don't develop in England the same way they do here? Is it simply money that, say, the Irish or the Jewish or the, you know what I'm saying?
If you mean pressure groups like that, it's simply that ethnic politics isn't considered a respectable way of carrying on in Britain in the same way as it is here, but also that or it isn't yet. There are signs increasingly that the Muslim population would like probably to emulate something like what's thought of in America as ethnic politics. But other than that, no, it's been simply more homogenous in point of religion and race until recently than the United States. But so that's a quick one on that. I once nearly went to prison on the Official Secrets Act, and I can tell you that it's an act where if you're prosecuted, you are guilty. It's one of those laws that every authoritarian state has to have in reserve. It means if you're charged, it means you've broken the law. You cannot defend yourself from a charge of breaking the Official Secrets Act. If the government says it's a secret, says this law, that means it is a secret. You cannot defend yourself by saying, but the information is in the public domain, or is already known. They say that's not true. Legally, it's a secret. This was, I don't know if you've ever been to London or if you know what London looks like. There's a very prominent building on the skyline called the Post Office Tower. It's the tallest building in London. I was involved in a trial where the existence of that tower was defined as an official secret. And the tower couldn't be referred to in open court.
You're not talking about the telecommunications tower, the big tall tower that we see when we're over there.
So because it's part of a network that involves security, it can be defined, its existence can be defined and upheld in open court as an official secret, so you can't call it by its name.
Richard?
I want to differ a little
on
the pressure group question, because I think the problem of the Labour Party in Kinnock has been pressure groups within Labour. You have the old union bosses, you have the left-wing militants, you have distinct pressure groups on Kinnock, and his big problem has been to try and get the Labour Party to the center and become more moderate so that they're electable. Otherwise, they're not. You see, and then there's the ban the bomb. So you have all these problems. On secrecy, many of the newspaper editors that I talked to thought this was a very serious and grave problem in Britain today. And the lady was right.
What's your favorite British newspaper?
Well, I write for The Economist. I could hardly say less. I think I like The Independent.
Still write for The Independent, Christopher Hitchens?
No, I don't. I actually now work for the Sunday Correspondent, to which hereby I give, if my working for it can be said to be a plug. But if I was there during the day, the weekday, I would read The Independent. Sure.
Hastboro, Pennsylvania, next.
That's Hatboro. Good morning, Brian.
Hi.
Enjoy your program very much.
Thank you.
My question is for Mr. Hitchens. You had a question earlier about comparative government systems. And I was astounded to learn that in the next British election, in order for Labour to take over, that even if they had an historic swing of, say, 8%, that Mrs. Thatcher and the Conservatives would still retain power. And in the sense that I believe it's the Liberal Party got like 20 or 25% of the vote in the last election, but they only have like 16 seats out of 600 and some. How is that? And seems very undemocratic.
It does when you look at it in the aggregate, yes. The advantage of the system, I'm not particularly defending it. I think there's quite a lot to be said for having proportional representation. The advantage of the system is it does encourage, at any rate, if it doesn't compel people to make up their minds. I think that a lot of people who voted Liberal, who wouldn't have voted Liberal if they thought it was going to be the governing party, in other words, just a protest vote. Sometimes they get 20%, sometimes they get 5%. The fluctuation is so great that I think we have to assume, in part, that's a don't-know vote. Now, the don't-knows in Britain don't get many seats under that system, and I think that's quite a good thing. It means those who stand for something have the best chance of thrashing out between them who's going to be the government.
Mrs. Thatcher has
I wouldn't want to fool with that too much.
Has a 100, out of 650, she has a 100 vote majority, a 100 member majority.
It's the first past the post system, but we should point out to the listener that proportional representation is a big political issue in Britain, and it's David Owen's main argument that he doesn't think that you can really have representative government until you get it.
I think the problem with representative government in Britain is not that it is not in the polling booth. I think, in fact, probably most governments represent roughly what the choice of the people has been in those election years. There have been no fluke results where people have got what they didn't vote for. The problem is, once Thatcher has a 100-seat majority, she can do what she wants. And so could a Labour Prime Minister if he wanted to. There is no written constitution. Now, quite a number of us in Britain are loosely associated with a group called Charter 88. Have been arguing for a long time for an American-style Bill of Rights to limit what Parliament may do by way of arrogating power to itself. And that's quite a live debate in Britain now, whether we should have the American system. I think it'd be wonderful if there was a real special relationship trade and you got a question time and we got a written constitution out of the exchange.
Gävle, Sweden. Next. Go ahead, please.
Look, what are the feelings of these two gentlemen on the effect of the democratization of Eastern Europe on Africa, and particularly Britain's former colonies?
Well, I'm not sure I know the connection between the democratization of Eastern Europe and Britain's former colonies. Did I miss something there?
I mean, I thought he said Eastern Africa.
Eastern Africa?
I believe. Maybe he didn't. I think this is a gentleman that called the other day from
I don't think I got his point.
Does he mean
I'm sorry to say.
the influence of the democratization of Eastern Europe on the rest of the world? Because there's something to that. You see, that everybody now is demanding their independence, right and left, you know, and that would be true in Africa.
Sure.
Next call is appropriate. New Britain, Connecticut. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I was living in Salford in the 84-85 period when there was a miners' strike. And I also had to take the bus early in the morning where there were a bunch of kids, teenagers, who had left school, and they were off to training programs for jobs that apparently didn't exist and never would exist. My question is, what's happened now 5 years later about the miners? That strike was broken. And also, is unemployment in the North growing as rapidly as it was? My last comment is about Christopher Hitchens. I read his column regularly in The Nation, and I think he's the best thing to hit American journalism since I.F. Stone.
Thanks.
Well,
that's it.
Well, that's too kind for a start, and I don't deserve the comparison, but it's very nice of you to say so. What happened with the miners after the strike was broken is that the union was split, basically. Those who hadn't agreed with the union's conduct of the strike, especially those who thought there should have been a ballot before the strike was called, have set up their own union. It's a bit early to say how far that will go because the tradition of British mine workers is very much one of unity and solidarity, and there's great distrust of any split in the union. Nonetheless, there was a real disagreement. The future there is going to depend on whether any more coal is found and on how long the oil in the North Sea lasts, because obviously that's going to decide the importance of coal and coal mining for a long time. Unemployment, meanwhile, to answer your second point, doesn't continue to go up, but what does happen is that the number of people who've not yet ever had a job, there's still only one person in the figures, gets, if you like, a more dense, thick unemployment figure, i.e. permanent unemployment, people who've never worked or are never going to work again.
Whatever happened to the ambulance strike?
That was brilliant. That's been more or less won. They were great because they didn't go on strike. They kept answering emergency calls, but they picketed the rest of the time and asked the public to support them.
So it's over?
As far as I gather, they've more or less carried their point, yeah.
It's always one of the dangers when you watch Question Time.
The Thatcherites are incredibly stupid in the way they handled that.
When you watch Question Time, you hear about an issue, all of a sudden, it keeps going every week, and all of a sudden you don't hear about it anymore. See, let me grab this call, and then it'll be our last
call. It may have been
for
declared an official secret.
Seattle, Washington. Go ahead, please.
Oh, good morning. It's very early here this morning. I was going to ask a question about the charming accent that the Englishman has. Apparently, it's not just the accent, it's also vocabulary. Have there been any studies about how many words Britons know as opposed to how many Americans know?
Richard.
Well, I mean, Shakespeare knew more words than anybody. His vocabulary is about 3 times. I don't think it's a matter of knowing words. I think it's a matter of training and thought. And the British, partly, one thing I wanted to get in that we haven't got is that the British is a very cohesive, coherent country. It's small. You can see the whole thing, and it's affected their whole way of life. They can think abstractly and then put it into words. And Americans can't do that. It has something to do with our geography.
You said that you can drop Great Britain into Oregon?
Into Oregon. It's so small, and that's the whole works, you see. And you can see it. It's very strange. Now, we've been talking politics and everything. You have to keep in mind that everybody in Britain watches the same TV news every night. They read the same essentially 15 newspapers or so. It's a society that you have an issue, and everybody in the country knows about it and talks about it that day. And this is not, we're not like that at all. I mean, you can be out in some of the people you've talked to, Seattle, Wyoming, or whatever, they're not remotely interested in the issues that Washington is.
Chris Hitchens, although they have 4 channels over that most people watch, there's cable is under construction. You have Sky television from Rupert Murdoch. You have the new BSB, which is a new direct satellite to home. Will that change the way the Brits live?
You're bound to, yes, because as you say, it's such a small village. But I think it'll still take some time to sort of shape people's attachment to the idea of the authority, in a sense, of the BBC, the traditional feeling that that's where you turn when you want either high-grade information or entertainment.
These are the 2 books we've been talking about here on the program this morning, and they're both about Britain. Obviously, coming at it from a different angle, one an American, Richard Critchfield, which is this one right here. He is currently living in Berkeley, worked for the Washington Star for 10 years, still writes for The Economist, and completed this book a couple of months ago. And then the other one, Christopher Hitchens, who lives in Washington, is a British citizen, although has been in the United States for 10 years and also writes for The Nation. These two books in your bookstores as we speak this morning. By the way, if people were to go out and buy both of these books, would they find completely different approaches to this? And is it, you know, this is kind of a leading question, but is it, what's the difference?
They fit together miraculously, because Christopher, we both deal with the big issue of Greece to Rome, that is Britain, the Greece to our Rome, and it's the name of his first chapter, and it's the name of the last section of my book. I mean, they sort of jibe, really.
By the way, we didn't show you this, but one of the reasons why we didn't talk about the morning news magazines and the papers, here's what's on the cover of Newsweek, their cover story. They talk about timber, and you can see the owl is on the cover of Time magazine. And then it's 40 years after the Korean War are the three news magazines for the week. Thank you both very much for joining us. As we said earlier, this is our day to celebrate the 50 millionth home hooked up to C-SPAN network. There are 92 million homes in America, so there's a long way to go. And as we said, we're celebrating the Adelphia cable system in Falmouth, Massachusetts. The general manager is Jim Sweeney. And as a close to this program, here is which sounds self-serving, but it's the way the lady spoke about C-SPAN and what it means to her. She's a high school teacher, and her name is Christine Fortin, as a way of saying, have a nice week.
It's exciting to be the 50 millionth viewer. C-SPAN gives me the opportunity to see what's happening in Congress through my own perspective rather than through other forms of media, through other people, through the media. C-SPAN also allows me to see how I'm being represented in Congress by the people that I vote for. As a teacher, I feel that C-SPAN can give my kids an opportunity to see what happens in Congress, to see how the bills become laws, to see how they're being represented. I feel that television is an important media for my students because they buy into television. These kids and their generation really buy in to things that they see, things that are happening in action. I think that C-SPAN is a good way for anyone to become educated and well-informed as to how that government works.
A note that the guests on our call-in program this evening at 6:30 Eastern Time will discuss the various influences that face the media. We'll hear about messages that the media is sending through news reporters, editors, and producers, when we're joined by a media critic for the New York City Tribune and a representative from Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. Again, that's this evening at 6:30 Eastern Time, 3:30 on the West Coast. In just a moment, a discussion of freedom in Palestine.
Ignorance of the law is no defense. Tune to C-SPAN's America and the Courts. You'll get in-depth information about the federal judiciary,